Hey everyone, Comic Book Paul here again, and welcome to my video on the ages of comics. The reason I have determined my own, if you will, ages of comics, as I said before, were determined how I bagged and boarded my books. So I'm just going to give an explanation of my opinion of the different ages based on current defined eras, my own opinion, and other things such as the size of books and paper quality and other developments in comics. The Victorian age. Starting in roughly way back in 1828, technically it really began with the publication of what was known as The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck in 1842, which is basically the unauthorized publication of a French series of comic strips called Les Amours de Monsieur Villebois. You like that? That's my best French. In 1933. Considered to be the first real comic book, it tells the story of Mr. Villebois finding another man for the affections of a woman. But basically that book is considered the first where it had sequential pictures with captions. It didn't have text bubbles quite yet, but pictures in order telling the story with captions. Comic strips, however, can be traced. See what I did there? Traced? Yeah. As far back as 1828, with the introduction of lithography and the subsequent publication of a book called Life in Philadelphia. The creator E.W. Clay parodied middle-class African Americans for their perceived social and political aspirations. His racist, let's face it, they were, caricatures were hugely popular at the time and were reproduced and imitated by cartoonists in New York, London and other cities. Yes, it's an unfortunate origin to have, perhaps, not perhaps, it is, and it's deservedly forgotten now, but it was the beginning of mass-produced, popular drawn stories. The Victorian Age of Comics. Life in Philadelphia 1828 to The Yellow Kid in McFadden's Flats, October 1896. The Platinum Age. Now, while I don't have any Platinum Age books myself, I do know someone who actually does. But it beginning with the release of the book called The Yellow Kid in McFadden's Flats. This was a collection of strips from cartoonist Richard F. Outcult's newspaper comic strip Hogan's Alley, whereas the neologism, or the term, comic book is printed on the back cover, so it could very well be the first instance where the term comic book, as two words, was found. It wasn't until the publication of Comic Monthly in 1922 did we get a monthly comic. It reprinted black and white stripes, but only lasted a year. This era was dominated with funnies, such as Al Smith's famous Mutt and Jeff, Ham Fisher's Joe Palooka, and Percy Crosby's Skippy. During this time arrived, though, one of the most famous and beloved characters of all time, with L.Z. Chrysler Sager's Popeye, we all know Popeye, who first appeared in King Features comic strip Thimble Theatre on January 17, 1929. During the Great Depression, though, funnies were a major moneymaker, but by the end of the 30s, and the Depression had ended and people were becoming more successful and had a bit more disposable income, attitudes had started to change. The Platinum Age of Comics. Yellow Kid in McFadden's Flats, October 1896, to Action Comics number 1, June 1938. The Golden Age. When editor Vince Sullivan quickly needed a book in the summer of 1938, he grabbed a random story from a slush pile and using it as a cover, but just as a backup story. He quickly published, among other stories in that book, a young Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster's Superman. Printing in Action Comics number 1, the success of Superman and that prompted editors at National Comics Publications, which was the future DC Comics, to request more superheroes for his titles. In response, Messrs. Bob Kane and Bill Finger created Batman, who debuted in Detective Comics number 27 in 1939. The period from the late 1930s through roughly the end of the 1940s, and beyond a wee bit, I'll get into that, is referred to by comic experts as the golden age of comics. It featured extremely large print runs, with Action Comics and Captain Marvel selling over 500,000 copies each month. Comics provided very popular cheap entertainment during the Second World War, especially among soldiers, but with erratic quality in stories, art and printing, it ended up in the early 1940s, over 90% of girls and boys from 7 to 17 read comics. So basically, while adults did enjoy reading at the time, they preferred sequential stories, good art, good quality publications, but it was so erratic with the war that they couldn't stay on, but kids loved it. Patriotic heroes done in red, white and blue were particularly popular during the time of the Second World War, following the Shield's debut in 1940. Many heroes of the time battled the Axis powers, such as Captain America #1, showing him punching Adolf Hitler. The period, though, from 1946 to 1959 is affectionately known by some as the Atomic Age of comics. Following the end of World War II, the popularity of superheroes greatly diminished, while the comic book industry itself expanded. The popularity of superhero comics waned. To retain reader interest, comic publishers diversified into other genres such as western, sci-fi, romance, crime and horror. Many superhero titles were cancelled or converted to other genres. A few well-established characters such as Superman, Batman and Wonder Woman continued to sell, but DC cancelled series starring The Flash and Green Lantern, and converted All American Comics and All Star Comics to western titles, and Star Spangled Comics to a war title. The publisher also launched its sci-fi titles as Strange Adventures and Mystery in Space. Timely Comics cancelled its Captain America, Human Torch and Submariner series, briefly reviving the characters in 1954, only to cancel them shortly thereafter, and to focus on horror, sci-fi, teen humour, romance and western. Romance comics became established with Prize Comics' Young Romance and Young Love, produced by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. Those titles' popularity led to an explosion of romance comics from many publishers. Circulation peaking out in 1952, when over 3,000 issues of various comics were published, with total circulation at about 1 billion. In 1952, the number of individual releases dropped every year for the rest of the decade, with the biggest losses coming in 1955 to 1956. From 1956 for the next few years, this period was called the interregnum. These rapid losses followed the introduction of the Comics Code Authority in the wake of Senate hearings on juvenile delinquency. This led to a decline in the medium and a shake-up of what was being printed and what was popular. In this era, I don't have many books of Golden Age, but I do have Golden Age book boards and Golden Age mylar bags is what I would use for this era. The Golden Age of Comics. Action Comics #1, June 1938 to Showcase #4, October 1956.